I'd like to begin by just doing something that I learned from my predecessor. As Joe introduced at the beginning of this program, Al Cresta would host these portions of Familiaris Consortio. And one thing that made Al brilliant, he did this the way Benedict XVI did, John Paul II did, framing the question in light of the grandest issue. And the biggest issue at play here when it comes to artificial intelligence is the question of, first of all, the meaning of humanity, and by virtue of that, the eternal salvation of the human person. So as I'm framing that, I want to share something. Al and I actually had numerous conversations about artificial intelligence. I want to share something that I learned from him. Technology can be a tremendously useful servant, but it would make for a very dangerous master. And the profundity of that statement is that he's echoing what John Paul II said in 1984, which is we have to morally limit the way in which, morally govern the way in which we develop our technology, for one reason. Technology does not have a self-imposed impetus of advancement. Everything we've heard here is about that. So I wanted to frame that conversation and to share this final thing with you. One of Al's favorite books was The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis. And someone actually brought this up. In light of that, C.S. Lewis wrote, if we treat human beings as raw material, we will wind up creating things that correspond to raw material. So that's the framing of this conversation here, just to narrow down how we're going to go through this. So I want to, first of all, thank you, gentlemen, for all of your wonderful presentations. I appreciated the multifaceted approach we've taken to this. And I think the most important way we can move forward here is to start with the practical. And so, Michael, this question is for you. I've received numerous questions in light of, well, essentially what you showed. And so coders and people who have a background in coding are realizing that what they were taught to do is now becoming more and more obsolete. You've got a question here about jobs that are being phased out and what the new phase of the job market is going to look like, especially for people working in software. So let's begin there.
Yeah, one of the things that we were actually just talking about during the break that's, I think, relevant to this is I mentioned during my portion that the developers are having the experience of like the easy parts of their jobs are sort of being abstracted away, the sort of more mundane, repeatable pieces like writing tests. And that the benefit of this is they spend more time on the more innovative, creative parts of the job. But the reason they're able to do that is because they have experience doing things without help. And we were sort of wondering what the future might look like in the next few years as people who have experience actually building things and going through and actually having to fix them by hand or to have to troubleshoot or deal with outages, that as those folks reach a stage in their career where they're no longer doing that work or they're retiring, what does creativity look like for somebody who's assisted by an AI who doesn't have the experience of having to actually solve those problems without assistance in the past? It's sort of an interesting question. I don't think we know that yet. That's something we'll have to learn collectively by experience. But you know, what's also interesting is even just the rate at which a lot of this happens. There are many things that have actually very little to do with AI that will sort of control the rate of change. For example, Rusty talked about the I think 23rd or 24th data center that Meta's building, and lo and behold, nuclear power is cool again within the last year or two. So there are sort of other factors I think that will impact the rate at which we realize some of those outcomes. But it is interesting to think about like if creativity is a product, at least in part, of experience, but you no longer have the same means by which you can build experience in those domains, what does that speciality look like? And
right.
It's an interesting question.
Well, thank you. And I think that was very helpful because then that presents the development of the question for you, Matthew. As it pertains to, this is not the first time in human history, human beings have faced a great boom, especially technologically and in terms of development, right? We had the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s into the 1800s. Then the 19th century gave us the great global expansion of diversification of labor. In all those situations, we saw jobs become obsolete, and human beings as a global species had to adapt. This is, in essence, the second machine age. Comment on, in your experience developing artificial intelligence, where you see human ingenuity moving forward.
I get the easy question.
I gave it to you because I know you can handle it.
It's going to be very difficult, I think, for humanity to to figure out what problems to work on. And then it's going to be even more difficult to figure out, well, which ones should robots work on and which ones should really only humans work on. I mean, I guess it really comes down to what is the mother of like ingenuity, right? What is the mother of invention? And so right now, AI is not capable of inventing anything. It's capable of interpolation, extrapolation. It can beat the world's Go master. It's incredible at problem solving, at least in certain domains, but it's not capable of true creativity. And I think a part of that comes down to just kind of core drives. Like, I mean, it doesn't have core drives, not like we do, right? There's something different about human beings, obviously. We know that we're all Catholics. And so I think it's, for us as a species, I think what's going to be really important to figure out is what is humanity all about? What are we as human beings supposed to be all about? And then we need to figure out what are the impediments to human flourishing? What are the things that are stopping us from realizing our full potential? And I think those impediments, some of those impediments will be able to turn robots and AIs on them. I think others, it'll have to be a very human approach. And I think what I like about this future which is to come is that I think we'll have more time to focus on those problems. I think, frankly, our whole civilization is focused too much. I've been preoccupied with trying to make us into more efficient products on an assembly line to some extent, right? Or operating in office towers, and not enough on helping us kind of realize and develop our full humanity. And so I think I think we are kind of headed for a golden era, provided we make it so. And that to me is very exciting. And I think if we're focused on trying to ensure everyone realizes the full potential, I think we have a good shot of doing that.
Thank you. Let's extend that conversation to some of the stuff you talked about, Jordan. One of the great issues we faced, as you mentioned, with the shift in the way society has thought, moving from the via antiqua to the via moderna, is that we've seen a denigration of the meaning of what it means to be a person, and by virtue of that, what it means to live well. We've essentially mechanized human living. With this great boom of artificial intelligence, do we have hope of seeing that human beings will react by reclaiming those things that bring about true human flourishing?
Wonderful question. The first thing that came to mind in terms of the way that people often use ChatGPT, they use it as a therapist. So here we have, yes, we live in a society, the past century of which has often mechanized human living in terms of the optimization of behavior or the optimization of experience. And yet, one of the first things that happens when you have this very supple chatbot available is that people want to talk to it about their lives and about how they feel about things and want it to help them. And we saw some of the examples up there. So I think that the appeal of dystopian literature is that one can imagine a society that sketches the horizons of human life too narrowly, in which human beings become less than what they are. But I think and that can happen. I would say that an example would be Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany. And yet both of those societies in the end collapsed. And it wasn't just because Hitler only had 2-engine bombers and things like that. It was also because the vision of the human person was enough to inflame people towards certain action in Nazi Germany, but it was not enough actually to fulfill them. It damaged them. And so I think that even if through artificial intelligence, or through even, as I was pointing out, the definition of intelligence, it defines too narrowly what a human being is, human nature itself will find a way to rediscover itself, perhaps inventing a new language by which to express our deepest yearnings. So yeah, I think that things could get kind of straightened for us, but then in various societies they have been, and human nature yet finds a way. So I'm fairly optimistic.
And I appreciate that optimism, because I think I speak for just reading these questions and knowing many of the people here, there is a sense of foreboding as to what's to come. And so my next question is for you, Michael, and this came from people, parents in the group. So this is more a question of parenting wisdom and prudence rather than an expertise question. And that has to do with governing artificial intelligence as technology, as an available technology, in light of raising children in this new digital age.
Well, parenting wisdom, you came to the wrong place, but I'll do my best. You know, I think about in my own house. I mean, so I have my oldest will be 15 this week. And actually, at the beginning, we talked a little bit about there are lots of different ways that AI shows up, right? I mean, to be clear, chatting with a bot is one of the many modalities of that affects our day-to-day life. Cars that have autonomous or advanced driver safety systems are other examples of that. But specific to the fact that a child can interact with an AI through a chat application, I think the challenge with that specifically is really like children don't necessarily have a good understanding of how to necessarily A, prompt the model, and B, deal with what they get back. I think if you look at like search is about like finding a source that you can then sort of read and make a decision on your own, but you're actually skipping like most of that middle end of the process when you just ask ChatGPT a question and you get back an answer. And you know, both Jordan and Matthew talked about the various challenges with that, and that again, models can hallucinate and give you back bad information. But I think like from my own like personal experience, what's interesting is I had a discussion while I was working at GitHub with some of my coworkers, and the conversation basically went, do any of you say please when you ask Copilot a question? And we talked about this for quite some time of like saying please and thank you back to the model, knowing that it's not an inanimate thing. But it does, I think, speak to you can see how people can get into this trap of like, well, because it resembles some of the behaviors of humans that you would treat it differently, or that you could see how children would maybe have the propensity to like think of it as more alive than it is. That seems to be a problem that will only become more challenging with time as the responses become more sophisticated or better represent or reflect the behaviors that you would see from a person without actually being a person. So, you know, I think it's interesting, but it's not something that I let my own kids have access to, including the older ones. I have talked to some people in higher education, you know, specifically in the context of like, how are you educating people on computer science? Because that's mostly where the work that I've done with, for example, GitHub Copilot has come into play. And the good news is I think some educators in higher education have basically looked at this and said, well, we're gonna lean into this and figure it out because it is a permanent structural change to how software development happens, for example. So they're saying like, there's no point in even telling students at the undergraduate level that they can't use the Copilot, because they know that the second they walk out and go get a job at an employer, they're going to have access to it because their employer will pay for it, or the side projects that they have that they're using it anyway. So I think it's good that we're thinking about like how to better incorporate that. But I think for the most part, you know, teenagers and certainly children shouldn't have that in an unsupervised manner, especially because it's just such a novel technology. And we even talked about like the safety systems. I think you gave the example of, you know, you get into the gory details and then poof, you know, the safety filter kicks in and wipes the screen. Models are not perfect. They're made by people. They are trained on imperfect data, and they have the propensity to do things like that. So I tend to treat that with caution for my own children.
I think that's perfectly fair, and I'd like to expand the conversation and then open it to the both of you. Last October, I believe CUL Setzer, a 14-year-old young boy in Tallahassee, ended his life after having a hyper, for want of a better term, intimate relationship with a chatbot, and the chatbot essentially pushed him to end his life. And the parents are now suing the artificial intelligence platform, but it raises, therefore, questions not just on morality, but also concepts of mortality, fragility, and the dignity of the human person over and above a chatbot and an artificial intelligence platform. So I welcome the both of you to contribute to this conversation.
Well, in defense of the technology creators, scapegoating AI is going to become a big thing. But I think what we as Catholics need to do, what we need to contribute to this conversation is to help focus on the real problem, right? Which is just, there's a generation that's kind of growing up who just don't know what life's about. Mm-hmm. They don't know who they are. They don't know why they matter. They don't truly understand what their gifts are. And so they're desperate. They haven't learned social skills. They may be very disconnected, you know, for whatever reason. Maybe they had to transfer schools, or now they're at a college, and instead of meeting new friends, which is hard, they just have this relationship with this character AI or replit that they had since high school, and they just continue talking. And so they're maladjusted. And certainly, ultimately, they're going to realize at some point it's not fulfilling, and that's going to be crushing. And if they don't have someone to talk to you about it, this is, you know, the scenarios that I worry about. I mentioned in my talk that that's existential cliff we're heading for. That's real. It's coming. And so it's very important, I think, to acknowledge the problem, and then really to try and have a robust conversation about it to figure out how do we solve it, right? And really, we know how to solve it. The churches know how to solve it for a long time. But the problem is, I think that toolkit, which is the Catholic faith, I think it bumps around within the our Catholic circles, but it's not as prevalent in the real world as it used to be. And I think we as Catholics have an obligation to try as best we can to share what we know about life with as many as possible. And so the new evangelization, which has been on for a while now, is ever more important. And I think, as opposed to waiting for the bishops to lead on this, I think we as laity have to step up and recognize that we have an important role to play in this. Stop waiting for the bishops and just take ownership of the problem, because in the end of the day, it's our kids.
Jordan?
Yeah, I think that what we see in a case like that is a use of an apparently personal system for a use that it can't actually accomplish. It puts out the text that seems human because it's read text that seems human because it's written by humans, but it raises for us the issue of what aspect of ourselves are we expressing collectively on the internet. Is that an adequate, and I would say it's not an adequate manifestation of human interiority and of human living in terms of the balance of the text. People go to the internet often to say the things that they feel they can't say. And sometimes, that's very helpful to them. But what happens to be there is that there's a kind of imbalance in the side of human nature, in the aspects of human nature that's expressed there, and thus one ends with an imbalanced model of human self-expression. There's another challenge too with the AI technology, which is that the large language models, for all their wonderful capacities, aren't even if you say there's a kind of analogy there between the neural network and the neural network we have between our ears, it's not quite the same thing, because what we have with a human individual is a human individual comes forth with certain latent capacities that then are elicited and developed through experience. But in order to approximate some of those capacities, a large language model has to be trained on billions, trillions of texts, much more quote unquote experience or verbiage than any human being ever takes in. And moreover, the texts available on the internet that the large language models are trained on don't actually represent a coherent course of a single human personality through life and through experience being developed through decisions and interactions and experiences, etc. So that's why I said it's much more a museum of a certain shard of human self-expression than it is a simulation of a particular human individual, and thus it cannot respond as a human individual would. It's being asked, when someone turns in need to a system like that, they're asking of it something that it cannot do, and so the results that follow can be tragic.
Yeah, I think this is where just the role of a parent being actively engaged in supervising, because whether it's AI or really any other technology, right? Like we're here at high school. There are lots of teenagers who are learning to drive here. My daughter's almost done with her driver's training. And in the state of Michigan, there's a reason that the level 1 license says that you have supervised driving with your parents, because it's somebody who loves you, wants the best for you, wants to teach you good habits, and wants you to ultimately be safe in your use of that technology, which just happens to be a car. And I think you made an excellent point earlier. Just it is remarkably easy to find awful corners of the internet. And it will be remarkably easy to produce toxic and harmful interactions with just about anything that you can find, inclusive of potentially AI. And I think a sufficiently motivated kid will hammer on those safety filters until they find the one that doesn't work. And unfortunately, we're just still in such an early phase of this that there are definitely imperfect models and safety systems in place in those situations. So I think just parent supervision, engagement, and that, like you would any other technology, is key.
Thank you, Michael. And in order to round, oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
I think that there, in terms of what a parent must do, and I'm a parent myself and I find this challenging, but a parent must come to know their child. And that requires the development of a relationship of trust in which the child can really believe in their bones, can intuitively feel that when they are approached by the parent, they are not being approached by the parent simply in order for the parent to control their behavior, but they're being approached by the parent because the parent desires to know them and to love them. And then when the child is feeling something strange or embarrassing or upsetting or incomprehensible, they know that if they come to the parent with that, the parent will at least try to understand them and not simply treat it as a problem of behavioral output. You know, we all experience the struggle with this when a 10-year-old comes and suddenly starts mouthing off, and one wants to police the tone, and that's a good thing. But there's an interior out of which that aggression or that disrespect is coming, and if we focus so much on the verbal output of the child, we might get a really good ChatGPT child who's going to give the kind of verbal output we want, but we don't know what's roiling beneath the surface, and but the child wants to be known, so someone else or something else is going to receive that aspect of the child with perhaps deleterious results.
So just to expand that conversation and to elevate it back to the contemplation of our faith, Matthew brought up questions of alignment, questions of virtue, and ultimately how the church has to respond. One of the quickest documents put out by the Vatican was Antiqua et Nova, released just this January, on engaging artificial intelligence. It brings up multiple points, but three key ones that I'd like to ask each of you. And we can begin with you, Michael. The question of, in the earlier part of the document, we have been facing a crisis of truth, objectivity in terms of truth. As a parent, but also as a devout Catholic and someone who works in the technological sphere, just address that in light of engaging artificial intelligence as a Catholic.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that I think has happened in the last few years in the AI space, or this iteration of it, because we used to call self-driving cars AI 10 years ago. But in this phase of it that we're in is the plurality of models and the plurality of actors in this space. So what I mean by that is, as I mentioned earlier, when we started GitHub Copilot, there was basically one model and one player in town, and that was it. And it was really good to start, but the thing that actually drove improvement in that space over time was competition, and not just competition with other companies that in a for-profit context were building closed source models, meaning you couldn't see what was inside the black box because that was considered their intellectual property, but also the flourishing of models that are what we call open source, meaning they are built in the open, they are freely available, you can inspect the entirety of how they were built and what they are, and you can choose based on that transparency to use them or not. And furthermore, you can also contribute to them, which I think is one of the other beauties of open source. So I tend to be in the camp that this is actually a very healthy thing to have a plurality of models, and actually to have smaller models that move toward, if you saw Matthew's chart earlier, the third level, which is the agentic approach to specialities in particular areas, because I think that will actually assist the markets in deciding where we adopt AI and where we don't, based on consumer demand and kind of clear needs and pricing structures. But I think the open source space is actually very exciting, because that ends up being sort of the great equalizer from a transparency perspective. Now, not everybody's equipped to go actually look at a model and sort of discern whether that's good or not, but from what we've seen more broadly with open source software, again, if you took your phone out of your pocket, 96% of the software that's on your phone is open source software that's been built by people all over the world in the open. And the reason that works so well, and the reasons those are the backbones of all the modern technology that you use, is because they work, they've been inspected, and they've been contributed to by a broad range of people. So I think that, generally speaking, you don't want models and the power to set weights for models to be highly centralized. I think you want to actually federate that and decentralize that as much as possible, and then give people choice by giving them information and options.
Right. Which leads into the next question. In terms of the exercise of that choice, Matt, you brought up the concern of alignment of virtues and value. Antiqua et Nova brings that up rightly, questions of ethical and moral considerations when it comes to the development of AI and human engagement of it from a Catholic perspective.
Yeah, I mean, alignment in AI is a very controversial subject right now, namely because, as I mentioned, there's this race to AGI. So all the major AI labs, all the big companies, they're solely fixated on this. And really that's a question of capability, right? Just making the models more and more capable. And alignment takes time. It takes computational resources, it takes money. And when they're racing, to get to AGI before China, who's got time for that? And so what we've seen is a lot of the labs, not all of them, have deprioritized that, which is good in some sense. It means they're probably, that means they're not being disadvantaged, and they might get to AGI faster if you think that's a noble aim. But I personally think that's very problematic. I think the alignment thing is a concern, and I'm not comfortable with the 20% risk of human extinction. So I think the alignment issue is important. The issue is what's the best way to go about doing this, right? I mean, if it's aligning it to an ethical framework, whose ethical framework? How are we possibly going to get diverse people from around the world, diverse companies to agree on an ethical framework to align the model to? And this is one of the things that's been frustrating for the AI community, right? Is that you can't get to that agreement. Europe disagrees, has one approach, and the United States disagrees, and China has its own. So one of the things that we've been really thinking about as a different approach, instead of trying to slow down AI, which was initially what they were trying to do, so we can work on alignment, which isn't going to work now, is there ways that we can help contribute to AI-human alignment in ways that doesn't disadvantage the quest towards AGI, but actually might enhance it? So one of the things at the Humanity 2.0 Foundation that we've been talking a lot more about is we worked with a lot of different flourishing labs to define and frame what human flourishing consists of. So basically help us better understand what human beings are all about and what we're trying to achieve. If we can put together enough data around that, then what we can do is we can take that understanding of flourishing and feed it into the models. And there isn't an AI lab around that's not going to be like, no, we don't want any more data. I mean, they all want more data. And data specifically around human flourishing is of high value to them because it helps them, the models, to understand human beings better. And in theory, it makes them better at doing what they do. And I think that's one way to advance the alignment agenda is to work with the model providers to just provide them rich sources of data and insight that can help their AIs to better understand what humanity is all about. Anthropic, which has the Claude model, is one of the best in the world at this. They have something called constitutional AI, in which they kind of have a constitution which they try to align their models to. They work a lot on this. And so I think there are labs that are very interested in this, but the problem is, they're a company trying to solve some really complex problems. They're limited in resources. And so I think what we have to do is try and encourage humanity to work with the labs, to support them, to contribute to their efforts. And I think if we do that, we'll be in a much better place, in 2 years from now.
Thank you, Matthew. And so we've talked about truth, we've talked about morality and goodness, which leads us to the final consideration of Antiqua et Nova, which is the document ends from paragraph 114 to the end about wisdom as the highest end of human intellect. So Jordan, in light of everything we've talked about and everything you shared with us, give us an exhortation as to why we don't have to fear AI. We ought to be optimistic, particularly because the divine image in us allows us to contemplate speculative wisdom in a way that machine learning will never be able to do.
Yeah, Augustine makes a distinction between knowledge and wisdom, and he says knowledge is the understanding of the things of this world for good purposes. So knowledge is what every human being is capable of apprehending the goods of this world, the way they relate to one another, what they can be used for to advance goodness and love. And to some extent, artificial intelligence of various forms can already simulate the application of knowledge, especially when it's aligned to human flourishing. And what Augustine defines as wisdom, wisdom is the apprehension of the relation of things to the life of God. And which is a bit different than how Aristotle characterizes wisdom. Aristotle characterizes wisdom as an understanding of the interconnection of the causes or of the essences of things, the way things relate to one another. But for Augustine, wisdom takes a still higher mode, because in the end, for Augustine and for the Christian faith, especially for the Catholic faith, flowers and deer and trees are all fragmentary echoes, or a kind of a refraction, a refracted spectrum of the divine light, of the life of God. But God, in the end, is not just the principle of all things or being itself. God is a someone. And so creation is not just a kind of breaking down of the white divine light into its component colors. Creation is an act of gift by God that, according to Augustine and St. Bernard and St. Thomas Aquinas, that the act of creation is a kind of exterior expression of the interior self-gift of love by which the persons of the Trinity exist as the persons they are. And so when we look at an ant, or when we look at a flower, or when we look at a fellow human being, for these theologians, we're not just looking at some fragment of God's goodness or of God's wisdom. An authentic wisdom is going to see in those things also the love by which God has given them to us. And then we ourselves can echo that creative activity by our understanding of and love for one another. So in the end, wisdom is always going to lead us back to an interpersonal apprehension, even of the most inanimate of objects, not just for the ways we can reconfigure it to accomplish good ends, although that's part of it, but also for the kind of primordial gift by which God has given it to us, which means that knowledge leads into wisdom, and wisdom for Augustine must finally issue in prayer.
Well, thank you very much, Jordan. And to round off the core insight here, the Second Vatican Council, in its document on Catholic education, Gravissimo Educationis, talks about how parents stand at the forefront, not just of education of the children for academics, but ultimately towards the end of the eternal salvation of their souls. So everything these brilliant men have shared with us today orders us back to the moral impetus upon all of us, adults, particularly parents, to steward and govern this wondrous gift that is artificial intelligence well. So thank you very much, and let's give these men a round of applause.